So I found this lawnmower being given away by using a free app on my phone. And I know it doesn't look like much, but the bones are good, however the flesh, it needs a bit of help. Now to be honest, a lot of the viewers told me to use it for parts, but I think it's worth trying to save. But unfortunately, after looking at it, things get a bit out of hand and it needed a lot more work than I thought. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at this simple Bolens lawnmower. And the problem is that it's missing parts. However, the ad for it did mention that all it needed was a spark plug cleaning. Now I have to admit, that's a very specific diagnosis, but I'm sure you've heard the same kind of excuses like that before. So the first thing we're going to do is look it over and see what kind of condition this mower is in. And I hate to admit this out loud, but it's in really rough condition. It's very oily and dirty, not to mention the blade is even on upside down. And because of that, the part that is cutting the grass is now damaged, so a new blade will be needed. There's also gasoline in the fuel tank, but who knows how long it's been in there. But more importantly, is there enough oil in the engine, because if it was used with low oil, we might be in big trouble. Now I know it's tough to tell, but the dipstick says it's right at the low mark. However, the ground here is not level, so we might be alright. So as you might have guessed, we have a parts mower on hand ready to give up its parts. And don't worry, this mower's engine is probably in worse shape than the green one, but we're going to find out soon enough. We also had to find a brake handle too, which came from yet a different parts mower. Now, if you had to buy a new handle assembly, it would cost well over $100. But the problem is that this mower is barely worth that much in working condition. So the idea of investing that much into it is just unrealistic, so it's a good thing we had this parts mower on hand. And once the used parts have been installed, we'll prime the engine and then try starting it. And of course, it's not going to start for us. So next, we'll take off the air filter and then prime it with our own fuel. So yet again, it didn't start. I guess we'll take their advice and take out the spark plug and see if it needs to be cleaned or not. Well, it looks like they were right. The plug is covered in engine oil and is interfering with the spark. Now to save time from cleaning this plug, I'm just going to install a used plug from a different Briggs engine, but it'd be a good idea to replace it with a new one eventually. And surprisingly, it started and ran until we stopped it. So what's the problem with it then? Well, there could be two possible reasons. First, the primer bulb may not be working to spray fuel into the engine. Or secondly, the fuel is so old and stale that it's not able to get the engine started. However, once it is running, it's able to continue running. So on this type of primer system, the bulb will actually fill with fuel while using it, and I can definitely feel it pushing fuel into the engine. So right now, I'm leaning towards the gasoline being really old and stale and keeping it from starting. The other problem is that the engine is running really slow and a bit off, so there might be something wrong with the carb. But we won't know that until we get some fresh fuel into the tank for another test start. So yes, you could just pour fresh gasoline on top of what's already in the tank, but I'd rather empty the system first. Next, we'll take off the recoil and blower housing to see what the cooling fins look like, and what we find is quite amazing. So it turns out the ignition coil and the intake pipe are covered in an oily mess, and it'd be best if we clean it up. Now the cooling fins are not that bad in comparison, but we'll clean them up as well. Of course, it's up to you if you don't want to wait until the mower dries off. However, you'll have to be careful not to let the water get into the carb or engine while working on it. Now because of the condition we found the blade in, we'll need to inspect the key and the flywheel. We're checking to see if the key's been damaged, but as you can see, the top of the key still looks like a square, which means it's not been sheared. So next, we want to see how the springs are set up for the throttle and governor because of how slow the engine was running, but what we find is a huge mess. The throttle lever is all bent out of shape, and they even put an extra wire on here too. And I'm very certain that the smaller spring is supposed to be the governor spring, but it's in a weird spot. We'll then just take it off and put it back where it's supposed to be. However, the ends of the spring are pretty messed up. We'll just have to make some adjustments to the metal tab the spring is anchored to make up for the damage. So next up, we're going to drain the gasoline from the fuel tank and see just how bad it is for it to have this starting problem. And as you can tell by the color that it has, this gasoline's been in here for well over a year. So yes, year-old gasoline will still work in an engine, however, it won't work as well as it should. And in this case, it didn't have the punch it needed to light off for a cold start. Now, if you didn't know it, there's a low spot in the fuel tank that's still holding fuel, so I'll just use a paper towel to soak it up. Of course, we do plan on starting the engine again, but it'd be a good idea to top off the oil before we do that, otherwise we could hurt the engine. We'll then pour in fresh 100% gasoline with no ethanol in it, along with a good stabilizer too. Now, if you can't get ethanol-free gasoline in your area, I'd invest in a good stabilizer that also helps out with ethanol. So it is okay to use ethanol fuel in your mower, however, I wouldn't let it age in the tank, otherwise it'll wreak havoc on the rubber parts of your fuel system. And finally, we're going to try and start the engine. However, I'm going to leave off the air filter just so we can see how the springs are working. So we definitely need to do more adjusting to the governor spring anchor and throttle, but before we do that, we need to find out why this engine is running so poorly. And about the only thing we haven't looked at so far is the carb, and in this case we need to inspect the diaphragm. Because if the check valve flaps or the pumping diaphragm is not working like it should, it could cause the engine to not run well. Now if you don't want to mess with inspecting the diaphragm or you can't find one, you can always replace the entire fuel tank and carb as an assembly. And the best part is that these are still really cheap and you can find them for about $24 right now. Also, if your fuel tank still has a lot of dirt or debris sitting on top of it, you might want to consider cleaning it off before taking the carb off the fuel tank. However, it wouldn't matter too much on this one because there seems to be quite a lot of debris in the well under the carb. But at least we can see that the filter is doing its job, but all that debris could be restricting fuel flow through the carb. But yet a bigger problem is what we find on the diaphragm, and that is part of it is out of shape and needs to be replaced. Now I don't know what happened to it, and I'm not going to point any fingers yet, but I think some of you might already know the answer. Next, we'll carefully separate the diaphragm from the gasket and carb, and then we'll set it down next to the new one to compare them. And if you look at the top flap, you can see the opening around it is very distorted. Now it might not be the only problem, but I'm pretty certain it's not helping either. Next, we'll use carb cleaner to flush out all the debris in the well and on the screen too. We'll then clean up the pickup tube along with anything else that looks like it has debris on it. Now you don't need anything fancy to clean a carb, but a cleaner that can break up oil should work. Once everything has been cleaned the best you can, we can finally put the carb back together. Now to be completely honest, I used to not like the way this fuel system was set up. However, having worked on different styles since then, I now admire how simple it is. There's no fuel line to worry about, and you never have to worry about fuel draining into the engine. The real drawback is the fuel tank rusting out, but that's mainly due to poor storage conditions. Now at first, I didn't understand why the fuel tank was rusting out because it looks like it's made out of aluminum. But come to find out, the top part is bonded to the lower part, which is made out of steel. It's funny because it only took me decades of working on them to realize it. I'm also replacing that missing bolt for the front of the fuel tank, and hopefully it'll keep the tank from vibrating too much while the engine is running. Now don't forget, since the air filter is only foam, we need to oil it to help it capture dirt particles from getting inside the carb and engine. And once the cover is back on, we'll then prime the engine with fuel and then try starting it, and hopefully it runs better than before. And as you can tell, it's now running a whole lot better than it was before changing the diaphragm. Of course, it's not running like a new lawnmower, but it's running and we didn't have to strip it down for parts. Now we can't say the same for the donor mower, but its sacrifice only meant one mower will need to go to the scrapyard now. Unfortunately, this mower is not going to bring in a lot of money, but sometimes it's not just about the money, but you'll have to decide what that is. So my question is, would you have done what I did, robbing parts from other mowers just to get a $100 mower back up and running? Or should we have saved these parts for a better mower instead? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.